Good afternoon, everyone, members of ShareSoc. Thanks very much for joining us here today. Edison's delighted to be working with ShareSoc to put on events like this. Hopefully you're familiar with Edison and what we do, in case you don't. We're a global equity research and investment engagement firm. While we're probably best known for our research, we pride ourselves on doing much more than that. We put on roadshows, webinars, and we're proud of our digital marketing capabilities. Ultimately, the goal is to bring institutional quality research to the widest possible audience. Hence, we're very supportive of societies like ShareSoc. Some of our audience members may have met me already on the healthcare-focused trust piece we did late last year. My name's Neil Maroka. I'm a former healthcare and biotech equity research analyst, now providing capital markets advisory with Edison. Today, I'm joined by Aaron Atkar, one of our lead healthcare analysts at Edison. Aaron, do you want to start by giving us an introduction to yourself, your background, and your role at Edison?
Sure, yeah. Thank you, Neil. And thank you, members of ShareSoc, for joining us. For those that don't know me, my name's Aaron Atkar. I've been with Edison's healthcare team for nearly 3 years now. By way of a brief background, though, my formal training was very much in the life sciences. I completed my master's degree in chemistry at the University of Bristol. I went on to complete my PhD in chemical biology, focused on the very early stages of drug discovery, looking at target tractability assessments. I've got roughly 4 years of experience working at GSK in the med chem and chemical biology research labs at the Hertfordshire R&D sites. I joined Edison's healthcare team in January 2023. It's about 4 analysts on the team, and the team and I, we conduct equity research on a broad range of life science companies that we've got the pleasure of working with here at Edison. This is through from CNS companies, which we'll be talking about today, through to immuno-oncology, medtech, diagnostics, and the full breadth of disease areas, working with companies around the globe, but particular focus on Europe. Anyway, yeah, excited here to be keeping the focus on the CNS space today.
Great. Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, so today we're discussing what we've termed the CNS Renaissance. It's a period of rapid innovation in treatments for diseases in the central nervous system. For decades, drug development in this area was seen as too risky and too difficult. Success rates were low, clinical trials often failed, and big pharmaceutical companies largely walked away from neuroscience research. But that's changing. New technologies are overcoming the historical barriers that kept progress slow. And at the same time, Big Pharma is back. More than $50 billion has been invested in neuroscience deals in under 2 years. For investors, this matters. CNS disorders affect over 3 billion people globally, making them one of the biggest unmet needs in healthcare. The space is attracting venture funding, new ETFs, and renewed interest from large and mid-sized companies. So today, we're going to ask our expert analyst to help us unpack why this renaissance is happening, what it means for patients and investors, and where the best opportunities might lie. But before we take a deep dive into some of the findings of the report, it makes sense to provide a bit of context. So I'll pose this first question to Aaron. Aaron, can you explain what's driving the CNS Renaissance and why it matters for investors now?
Sure. So yeah, this is a good place to start. You've touched upon it just there. CNS conditions, they affect around 3.4 billion people globally. This is a huge number and it's pretty staggering, but that was published in a Lancet paper, so a high impact journal, so well recognized. So yeah, we trust this figure. There's a massive unmet need. It's a big number, but we think that includes those affected, so not just patients themselves. That includes carers, families, those close to people with these conditions. Yeah, the burden's huge. Now, looking back at this sort of space, historically, there's been about a 94% failure rate amongst sort of late stage CNS clinical trials. This failure rate's actually quite high for all indications, but we've seen that it's been particularly high for CNS. So, while 94%, while that seems like really quite a high failure rate, you could also look at it this way, right? If that could be improved to, say, just an 86% failure rate, then we'd essentially double the number of new CNS drug approvals that we're seeing. Now, again, Neil touched upon this briefly at the start, but yeah, it's a hard disease space. The challenge here is ultimately what led to pharma companies somewhat taken a step back from the sector, so back in the sort of 2010s. But more recently, we've seen approvals which sort of prove the concepts that we're seeing this renaissance. And a key example of that has been the first Alzheimer's disease modifying drugs in over 2 decades. Ultimately, the CNS conditions treatment market, this is projected to reach a sizable $250 billion by 2035. It's the second largest market segment behind oncology, but it's one of the fastest growing, driven by factors such as aging populations. So, in summary, the time is now. The medical needs are there, and now so are the technologies.
Great. Can you give us a quick example of a technology that didn't exist before but is making progress possible now?
Sure. So if we're looking at that sort of failure rate and how we can improve upon that, I'll highlight several key breakthrough technologies that we've seen that are really changing the game now. The first of which is blood-brain barrier crossing. So our brains are really sophisticated parts of the bodies, naturally, as you'd hope, and they've got mechanisms to stop what might be dangerous or toxic passing through the blood into the brain. But if we want effective CNS drugs, they've got to be designed to overcome that barrier. And finally, with new technologies, we're now more capable at delivering drugs to the brain. Another key technology is, it can't be ignored, AI-powered drug discovery. I think we can cover this in a bit more detail later on, but this has a plethora of benefits for drug discovery, and one of which being better target identification. So CNS conditions are incredibly complex, but if we can utilize AI tools to identify higher quality targets, that's going to get these programs off to the races. Another key technology, blood-based biomarkers. These can help with things like early diagnosis, which might help with treatment options. You can think of these like cholesterol tests, but for the brain. And then finally, just novel mechanisms of action, looking at these new targets, new technologies. Real breakthroughs in science. That's making things more possible now.
So very high-level technical stuff, but is this a scientific story first, or is this more of an investment cycle story?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in short, the answer is both. Sort of what I've covered off just there, they've kind of been more focused on the scientific progression side of things. But ultimately, these factors have been exacerbated by the investment cycle side of things. So in that, big pharma companies are now re-entering the space, mainly driven by a need to reinvest their clinical pipelines. But yeah, ultimately, I'd say both scientific combined with the investment cycle.
You mentioned some major drug approvals recently. What's the significance of drugs like Leqembi that were mentioned in the report?
Sure. So this is actually a really good place to start. Alzheimer's disease, it's one of the 3 indications that we want to deep dive a bit into today. Alzheimer's, it's perhaps one of the most well-known or most talked about CNS conditions. It's what's called a neurodegenerative disease. It's the most common type of dementia. It affects over 55 million people globally, and this is projected to reach, I think, nearly 80 million by 2030. Now, I'm sure a lot of people, myself included, have known people that have suffered with this horrible disease. But in terms of breakthroughs, you said it just there. We've got Leqembi. That's the brand name for a drug. The generic name is lecanemab, and this is from Biogen. And in a similar light as well, we've got Kisunla, generic name donanemab, and that's from Eli Lilly. These are the first drugs that have actually been shown to slow Alzheimer's progression, which essentially makes them disease-modifying therapies rather than just symptomatic treatments. Now, point out that with Biogen, the company had faced controversy over its prior drug, Aduhelm, which it was approved more recently. It was later withdrawn due to too many questions over its effectiveness. But yeah, look, Leqembi, Kisunla, real breakthroughs, disease-modifying treatments for Alzheimer's are finally here. And, these approvals are important. They've created regulatory precedent, meaning that the FDA, so the key US regulator, now has a validated pathway for approving new Alzheimer's disease drugs.
So are these drugs more symbolic of what's possible, or do they represent major commercial opportunities in their own right?
Sure. So I'd say that, ultimately, yeah, there's big commercial opportunity there. And that comes down to the fact that they're the first drugs of these type to be approved in quite a long time. But they're also symbolic for the same reasons. We expect now massive movements as researchers understand why these have been successful, maybe why other approaches have been less successful. And as part of the clinical development path for these new drugs, we've established ways now to both detect and measure improvements in what's ultimately a really complicated disease. Importantly, and also encouragingly, it provides that validation that disease modification is possible in such challenging brain conditions, perhaps one of the most challenging brain conditions.
Right. So now we've got an incredible opportunity in front of us. What's next in this exciting field?
Sure. So, while these approvals have been super exciting, my personal view on them is somewhat mixed. Yes, they are breakthroughs and they deserve to be hailed as such. However, while classified as disease modifying, I think it's important to take a step back and highlight the fact that they only slow down disease progression rather than halt it. It would be fair to question whether people close to an Alzheimer's patient would, say, recognize a significant benefit and quality of life outside the controlled setting of a clinical trial. And that's what it should be all about in the long term. Nevertheless, they do sort of offer this key step up from current treatment options. So it's definitely a win, something to be celebrated. The way we view these approvals, though, is that they should, open the door for better next generation therapies. Ultimately, there's lots of companies out there looking to take it to that next step, and we're seeing those coming through the pipeline, which is great to see. These main approvals of targeted amyloid plaques in the brain. There's also hypotheses that targeting tau proteins may be as effective. And, it doesn't just stop there. There's many key innovations coming through that we're seeing from, in particular, smaller, more sort of nimble biotech companies. To shout out a few, there's companies like Actinogen Medical, Alzanova, AC Immune. I think we touched upon these in more detail in the report, so I'd encourage everyone to have a look. But these are all biotechs exploring next generation targets, technologies, and approaches. So taking a step back, I think it's fair to say that, maybe you could compare these to early cancer drugs, maybe 20 years ago or so. You've seen sort of modest benefits initially, but they've paved the way for more transformative treatments, which we look forward to see coming through.
We're seeing a lot of different opportunities in front of us and a lot of different possibilities. Big pharmaceutical companies largely abandoned brain research a decade ago. Why are they suddenly investing $50 billion back into this area?
Sure. So we touched upon it earlier, and that ultimately just comes down to the challenges associated with CNS drug developments. And yeah, this made pharma companies somewhat pull back in the 2010s. So Eli Lilly, for example, and undeniably a key player. They developed Prozac for depression, but they really went through the ringer with some Alzheimer's program failures, which at the time led to workforce reductions, and they did get eventual redemption though with the recent approval of donanemab or Kisunla, which we just talked about. Pfizer, a similar sort of story. They had late stage clinical trial failures, which led to site closures and the pullback from there. So, we're talking about companies here that have invested through preclinical phase 1, phase 2, get to say phase 3, the final stage, but the biggest and most important. And if these therapies aren't demonstrating key benefits, then they're not going to make it through to approval. Just to touch on a couple more, GSK and AstraZeneca, they pulled back from the area to focus on more of their specialities, which was vaccines and oncology, respectively. And Bristol Myers, they struggled with next generation treatment developments. This is one, though, that also got redemption, like Lilly, and in this case with schizophrenia, which, yeah, we'll also come on to. But I suppose the ultimate question is, why are they now reinvesting into the area? Well, the truth is these pharma companies, they need to. That is, they need to make investments as they're facing major upcoming patent cliffs. This can be visualized in Exhibit 10 of the CNS thematic report we published. In particular, if you look at from 2028 onwards, major patent cliff. Healthcare is quite a unique sector in that pharma companies only get to enjoy revenues for the duration of their patent lives, after which generics and biosimilars come in and sort of eat away at the market share. But this is set up this way in the sector to drive continuous innovation. But yeah, it creates these patent cliffs every 10 to 15 years. So right now, big pharma's needing to take action to replenish their pipelines ahead of what's been estimated at over $200 billion in sales at risk between now and 2030. So in short, they need innovative new drug candidates as future revenue sources to replace blockbuster drugs that are going off patents. Why CNS? Well, for the reasons we're discussing, CNS offers huge markets with limited competition, in contrast to other areas like cardiometabolic disease, for example. It's like obesity. That's a super exciting space, but it's highly competitive. Similarly, oncology, it's the biggest segment, but it's incredibly competitive. I think something like you might find maybe like 5 or 6 names going after any one single target. In contrast, CNS, that might be like 2 or 3, for example. So the interest is there in the CNS space, the opportunities there. And, as such, we've seen a rise in the number of deals in the CNS space, some of which are premium pricing. So, yeah, it's truly there. The unmet needs there, and so are the opportunities.
So lots going on. Can you give us some examples of these recent deals?
Yeah, sure. So some recent examples. We saw Johnson & Johnson, they paid $14.6 billion US dollars, a 39% premium for the company Intracellular. This is a CNS-focused biotech. This was announced during the JP Morgan conference earlier this year. Bristol Myers, they paid $14 billion US dollars, which was a 53% premium for Karuna Therapeutics, mainly for its schizophrenia candidate KarXT. And this has since been approved under the brand name Cobenfy, and this represents the first new schizophrenia mechanism in 35 years, targeting different brain receptors. At a similar time, AbbVie acquired Cerevel Therapeutics for $8.7 billion. This was a 22% premium for its schizophrenia-focused CNS pipeline. I'll point out, though, that this was a bet that ultimately didn't pay off. The candidate failed to make it past phase 3, but nevertheless, the investment highlighted the interest. More recently as well, we saw AbbVie pay $1.2 billion for Gilgamesh's depression candidate, which is currently in phase 2. So, yeah, look, overall, these transactions show the big pharma confidence in the CNS subsector.
That's one side of the equation. What kinds of smaller companies are most attractive to big pharma buyers? And I'll add another question. Do you think that this interest is sustainable, or is it more opportunistic?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think ultimately, they're looking for more than just drugs. They're interested in technologies, platforms. Ultimately, it's about those with good data, almost regardless of clinical stage. We've seen big deals being done even for preclinical candidates where the data has been promising or there's been expandable opportunities. So, yeah, more than just drugs, technologies, platform, promise. In terms of sustainability, it's it's a tough one to kind of put a pin on. I think it's fair to say that we're in the early stages of the renaissance. So whether or not it's sustainable could be answered by whether or not we're able to make that next breakthrough. So, in other words, how incremental will that next breakthrough be? As we've kind of touched upon, the technology is promising, but yeah, this needs to translate into the next breakthrough result.
I believe schizophrenia is the second of the three target indications we wanted to elaborate on today. Why are you particularly interested in this space?
Yes, and I'll point out now that we're talking about a neuropsychiatric CNS condition rather than a neurodegenerative condition like Alzheimer's. So yeah, schizophrenia, it's not the most common condition. It affects about 1% of the global population. But we see this as a highly interesting area and one that's really at the sort of precipice of new innovations. The condition itself is characterized by positive symptoms, so that's those of like addition of a trait, so like hallucinations, negative symptoms, which is the lack of a trait, so sort of reduced emotional expression, for example, and then cognitive symptoms, which is impaired memory and attention. So like the field itself, it's really not seen much progression since the 1950s. Back then, we saw the approval of what's called typical antipsychotics, and these are designed to target dopamine receptors. These were later complemented by atypical antipsychotics, which were developed in the 1970s, and these target serotonin receptors, and they're sort of associated with fewer side effects. And while these drugs have been effective for mainly the positive symptoms of the condition, they've had somewhat limited efficacy against negative and cognitive symptoms. And what we've seen more recently is that the consensus is very much steering away now from the sort of dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia disease origin. So, there's a range of novel therapies now looking to surpass the effectiveness of what, if you take a step back, have been relatively poor treatments lacking durability, mainly targeting symptomatic relief. Now, we touched upon it earlier, but the real recent breakthrough in this field was the approval of Bristol Myers' Cobenfy, which was formerly known as KarXT. This is a combination treatment, one of the active ingredients of which that crosses the blood-brain barrier, and it represents what is a new first schizophrenia mechanism in about 35 years. So, this targets muscarinic receptors rather than targeting that dopamine hypothesis. So yeah, 35 years, first new mechanism. It's a real breakthrough just there. So that's why we're excited. It's a step forward because it addresses both those positive and the negative symptoms rather than just positive. And yeah, it offers these notable improvements over the historical antipsychotics. So, ultimately, this should significantly improve quality of life for both the patients themselves and those around them.
Right. So that's a super exciting breakthrough, but where do we go from here in the treatment of this disease?
So in terms of where we go from here, there are still gaps. For example, Cobenfy is associated with sort of multiple side effects. Furthermore, there's a subpopulation of schizophrenia called treatment-resistant schizophrenia, or sometimes referred to as TRS. So in which Cobenfy does not have a specific label for TRS. Now, this is classified as or defined as schizophrenia that does not respond to two or more medications, each with at least 6 weeks of treatment duration, and it affects about 30% of the whole schizophrenia population. If I may, I'd like to give a shout out to an Edison client, Neuron Pharmaceuticals, one that we work closely with and know very well. Neuron's developing a drug candidate called evenamide that's truly got a novel mechanism of action, and this is currently involved in a phase 3 program specifically looking at this TRS subpopulation, and it boasts a relatively safe side effect profile versus the other drugs that are out there. Prior studies for this drug candidate, it's helped patients with TRS achieve what's called clinical remission, meaning that by the end of their treatment regimen as part of the trial, they would be no longer classified as sort of being defined as having treatment-resistant schizophrenia. So, really quite an exciting potential opportunity there. And to our knowledge, this is the first phenomenon this is a phenomenon the first example of in schizophrenia. So yeah, the next key readout for this phase 3 program, it's in late 2026. We're looking forward to seeing the results, and yeah, I'd encourage everyone to go and have a look at what we've spoken about on that space in the reports, and we've got our research for neuron pharmaceuticals on the Edison website. But yeah, look, ultimately, it's a similar story with the Alzheimer's. The Cobenfy approval, evenamide clinical progress, essentially, look, they're exemplifying the resurgence of interest in the field, and we hope that that really paves the way for new innovations to follow.
So for individual investors, how can they actually invest in this theme, and what are the different ways to get exposure?
Sure. So look, there's a breadth of investment opportunities out there for the CNS space. Maybe we'll start with perhaps the most obvious way to take a diversified approach, and that's exchange traded funds, or ETFs. There are ETFs available now, dedicated and specialized, to provide broad CNS drug development exposure. So I think the two that we talked about in the report is the iShares Neuroscience and Healthcare ETF. This launched in August 2024. And there's the TEMA Neuroscience and Mental Health ETF launched January 24. So these can be thought of as sort of subsector specific mutual funds. We think, look, them being launched in 2024, that highlights the industry-wide interest in the field.
So that's interesting, but what about individual stocks?
Yeah, so in terms of individual stocks, we can think about these in sort of 3 classic categories. You've got your large cap options, and these can be thought of as somewhat more stable, although appreciate that's a bit of a subjective term. These are established players, so those like Biogen, Eli Lilly, Bristol Myers. These are big pharma companies we've talked about as having these recent breakthroughs. In terms of market cap, they could range from sort of 10 to hundreds of billions US dollars. In between there, we've got the sort of mid-cap specialists, so market cap region of about 1 to 20 billion US dollars. Companies like Neurocrine, Sage Therapeutics, focused CNS players with a bit more established than those smaller biotechs. So yeah, small cap innovation. These are the biotechs, the through and through, high risk, high reward. Often platform technologies, typically less than single-digit billions in terms of market cap. We view these as being the more nimble companies, and yeah, look, their size shouldn't be deceiving. It's a consistent thesis of our team that real innovation often stems from these sorts of companies, and if people don't see them in the headlines when new drugs are approved, it's typically because they're sort of acquired by big pharma companies as part of their typical sort of life cycles. Point out maybe that what we kind of talked about mostly have been traditional CNS therapeutics, but look, there's a broad range of different approaches out there, coming from companies that are pioneering their way in their sort of respective niches. So, for example, there's blood-brain barrier specialist companies, so looking at drug delivery like Denali Therapeutics. We've got AI biomarker imaging platform companies like the UK-based company Ixico. There's psychedelic therapeutic approaches out there, companies like Compass Pathways. We're talking about psychedelics such as psilocybin, which is the psychoactive component of magic mushrooms, but they're looking at taking just purely the active ingredient there, doing some dose testing, and they're looking at addressing treatment-resistant depression and PTSD with that. And then maybe the final niche I'll touch upon is gene therapies. So again, typically more associated with cancer or rare genetic conditions, but there's companies out there such as I think Voyager Therapeutics, truly a unique approach to CNS development in particular. And yeah, I'd encourage our audience to work through our report to learn more about the breadth of innovation currently out there.
So for those investors that are looking to wade into these individual stocks, can we touch upon some risk management considerations?
Sure. Yeah. Look, while we're not here to give advice, because advice needs to be personal, we'll highlight that risk management can be achieved through various sort of diversification approaches. This could be considered to be diversification across, say, development stages. So whether that be phase 1, 2, or 3, it could be diversification across disease area. So neurodegenerative, say, like your Alzheimer's, versus neuropsychiatric, like your schizophrenia. And then there's a broad range out there in terms of technology and general approach, whether that be small molecule technology, biologics, immunotherapies, gene therapy, which we've touched upon, and AI and imaging. Yeah, many different ways to diversify.
But what are the main risks that investors should be looking at or aware of in CNS investing?
Sure. So I guess it's worth pointing out that a lot of the risks that are true for drug discovery and biotech across all indications still apply to the CNS space. In particular, to cover off a few, and I'll try and highlight where there's some more CNS specific considerations, but the key one being clinical development risk. So despite advancements, this is still a highly challenging field. High failure rates do still persist. Nothing's ever guaranteed. And look, for the small biotechs in particular, it really does tend to be that sort of high risk, high reward situation. The other thing, investment time horizons. Drug discovery takes a long time. That's just a fact. 10 to 15 years is typical for drug developments. And we've seen that maybe for CNS in particular, it does tend to be at the longer end of that range versus other therapeutic areas. There's single asset risk as well that's worth considering. So, many biotech companies, they depend on one drug, meaning that, or drug candidate, I should say, and they're subject to what we call binary event risk. So this means that their share price may live or die, shoot up or drop notably, dependent on whether a clinical trial does or doesn't meet its primary or secondary endpoints, for example. And this ties into that high risk, high reward scenario for biotechs. I'll highlight though that this is maybe less pronounced for big pharma companies, but yeah, it does tie into that smaller biotech, high risk, high reward. Maybe if I'm sorry, just one more that's come to mind is the regulatory uncertainty. Novel mechanisms, they face unknown approval paths. Regulatory precedent is always going to streamline the clinical development process, but to get new and novel and exciting new therapies to market, they require sometimes additional regulatory considerations. But that being said, it's worth highlighting that with this renaissance, we are seeing those precedents being set in disease areas where we've seen the breakthrough so far, like Alzheimer's and schizophrenia. They should be paving the way for the next generation therapies.
And we may have covered this already, but is it worth mentioning some mitigating factors here?
Sure. So on this mitigating factors, yeah, look, to list a few examples, this is ultimately what the renaissance comes down to, and that's one of which we've got better tools and technologies available now, meaning that there's now more ways than ever to measure disease progression and assess potential efficacy of new drug candidates. We've seen that big pharma partnerships and deals, they provide validation that the time is now for this disease space. In other words, those sort of most clued up in the CNS space have been seen to increase their investments in the area, so that can be considered a mitigating factor. And if nothing else, the need is there. There's aging demographics creating a growing need for these new CNS therapies. I've said it before, but the competition's relatively lower for now. So yeah, there you go. And a final note on that maybe is, yeah, that of the portfolio approach, not putting all your eggs in one basket. Risk management can be achieved through the diversification across development stages, disease areas, and various technologies.
So from your perspective, which technologies or approaches have the most transformative potential over the next decade?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Essentially, I'll I'll go through a few. We've got blood-brain barrier crossing technologies. Like we touched upon this before. Historically, it's been a challenge, but with new technologies, new classes of drugs are now more accessible. That can cross the blood-brain barrier. So, this could be sort of cargo approaches with active ingredients via transport delivery mechanisms. I think in the report we touched upon focused ultrasound, viral vectors, nanoparticles, small molecule optimization. Appreciate that's a bit jargony, but yeah, new technologies to cross the blood-brain barrier. We've got AI and biomarkers, another key theme. It's impossible for any investor to ignore the role of AI and technology breakthroughs, but there's more to it than just chatbots, right? AI's got the potential to de-risk clinical trials and reduce costs. We've got psychedelics and neuroplastogens. These are advancing conditions like depression, PTSD, anxiety, the neuropsychiatric conditions. So yeah, in particular, this is used in psychoactive compounds, but in low doses and often in combination with therapy approaches like cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT as it's otherwise known. And then, yeah, again, I've touched upon this one before, so forgive me if I'm repeating myself, but with the cell and gene therapies, that's an exciting new technology, potentially curative approaches for rare neurological conditions. And these often target indications that are defined by specific gene mutations.
And which of these themes that you've covered do you think can generate the most investable companies in the near term versus those that are probably still more speculative?
So I think if I had to pick one, it's got to be AI and biomarkers. They kind of tie in with each other just there, but yeah, these are more than just chatbots. AI applications can be, for example, brain imaging, analysis, pattern recognition. This can be used for trial optimization, supporting recruitment efforts, monitoring, addressing high failure rates by matching the right type of patients to the right type of therapies. Biomarker discovery and validation. So AI can help with identifying new biomarkers that can support early diagnoses, track disease progression, and help with patient subgrouping and sort of conditions like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, for example. That can then be used to collect real-world data, for example, supporting efforts in sort of digitally tracking disease progression, sometimes in real time. Historically, this has been tough just because vast amounts of unstructured data and then processing it. But now with AI tools, it's possible. And then yeah, things like drug target interaction prediction and maybe protein structure modeling. So AI can help analyze large and complex data sets, things like genomics, proteomics, imaging, clinical data, and they can analyze these to help uncover new biological targets in CNS diseases where mechanisms may have previously been poorly understood due to their complexity. There's AI approaches out there now that accurately model 3D structure, and this was previously incredibly challenging, but that can also support drug development efforts. So yeah, taking a step back, AI, it's up there. Eventually you can picture a time where this may be able to mimic all complex things that we struggle with now related to CNS drug development. And I think once we're there with that, you'll then start to see sort of light year advancements in the technology itself, but then also saving time and money.
So before we wrap up, can we hear the deep dive into the third selected indication that we wanted to cover in the CNS space?
Sure. So yeah, there were three indications that I wanted to cover off in a bit more detail today. So yeah, we talked about Alzheimer's at the top and then schizophrenia somewhere in the middle just there. But the third one that I wanted to sort of shine the spotlight on as an interesting area is Parkinson's disease. This is the second most common neurodegenerative condition just behind Alzheimer's. Condition itself, yeah, it's characterized by sort of motor symptoms like rigidity, tremors, but also non-motor symptoms, so things like psychosis, Parkinson's associated dementia, and cognitive impairments. Those are just as debilitating and remain undertreated. In terms of prevalence, I think it's about 1 million in the US, a similar sort of figure, I think 1 or 1.2 in Europe, but over 10 million worldwide. And I think what's really staggering about this is the fact that this sort of global figure, it's sort of estimated to double by the 2040s due to an aging population. Now, similarly to schizophrenia, it kind of still relies on historical treatments a lot of the time. So levodopa remains the current standard of care as a first-line treatment for Parkinson's. The root cause of the condition is thought to be sort of degeneration of the nerve cells in the part of the brain that control movements. And when these nerve cells are impaired, they lose the ability to produce dopamine. Now, levodopa was sort of developed in the 1960s, approved in 1970, designed as a dopamine replacement agent. But yeah, the drug is associated with many side effects, and ultimately it's still a symptomatic treatment. There's been a lot of efforts into disease modification approaches, but yeah, the symptomatic treatment remains the mainstay, which sort of paves the way for breakthrough therapies. But yeah, look, we're seeing a range of new technologies now come through the pipeline, from cell therapies, peptides to small molecules, for example.
Are there any specific examples that you like to mention?
Sure. So shout out a biotech company called Herantis Pharma. They're developing a sort of peptide drug candidate called HER096. This is a peptide mimic of the protein called CDNF. And yeah, look, it's got disease modifying potential. It's got a multimodal mechanism of action targeting what's thought to be the root cause of the disease. So sort of up the pathway from the dopamine hypothesis, targeting the root cause, sort of like targeting the roots of a weed, to kind of really stop it. This is in the early stages of development, phase 1B, so very early. Their readouts for phase 1B should be coming soon, actually. It's their first test in Parkinson's disease patients, but we're very excited to follow the progress of an exciting new drug candidate that's backed by really interesting science and preclinical data. I'll point out as well, as a second example, recent deal between Novartis and Arrowhead Pharmaceuticals. This highlights an interest in a new mechanism and a new technology for the area. This was $200 million upfront for an early stage, so preclinical therapy, which again, it highlights the resurgence of interest from big pharma. So yeah, look, really excited to see what happens to the Parkinson's disease pipeline in the coming years.
What's your key takeaway message for investors who are considering this theme?
So in short, we're seeing a paradigm shift that can be considered comparable to cancer treatment revolution 20 years ago. This is in terms of the rate of new emerging technologies that are becoming available. Technology foundations that they're now in place after decades and decades of trial, error, repeat. And ultimately, that's coming now to present a massive market opportunity driven by things like aging populations, creating a growing need for innovative new neurological therapies. So we've seen the transformation. It's starting, albeit still at the early stages. As ever, diversification is key. Patience is important. And yeah, all that's sort of left to do is wait for further successes in the space to unfold.
Great. I'd like to invite anybody in the audience to pose any questions. I see Mike.
We've got one already. Rosita says, have I misunderstood? Is schizophrenia in 1% of the population? I can't remember what you said, Aaron. Was that
Yeah,
the
no,
number you used?
I think, yeah, I can clarify that. Sorry. Yeah. So schizophrenia, it's estimated, I think it's technically between 0.5 to 1% of the global population by some estimates. I mean, these things are hard to truly measure. I hope I haven't confused things when I said that treatment-resistant schizophrenia is 30% of the schizophrenia population itself. So of that
Okay.
sort of small portion of people worldwide that have schizophrenia, it's, yeah, about a third of those then broken down there that have that sub-label, if you will, of treatment resistance.
All right. Okay. So that's the kind of potential market. Okay. That's good. I had some from earlier on that was submitted before the analyst. I was surprised somebody didn't put these in, but I'm just reading these. Are the health economics more difficult for this disease area than for many others, given the relatively small market size and or age-related nature of them?
It's a good question. I don't think we've seen anything glaringly obvious in terms of health economics that pull CNS treatments out as being more challenging than others. I mean, yeah, you can argue that they're more prevalent in older populations, but if we compare, say, to cancer treatment these days, you know, we know so much about cancer. Cancer's a broad range of disease areas that can be broken down into subclasses and, you know, genetic mutations within that. And a lot of the time with the new therapies that we're seeing come through the pipeline they're, you know, they might be targeting, you know, a mutation within a subtype of cancer based on a broader type of cancer. So, yeah, the numbers can be deceiving, but yeah, I don't think that there's anything too specific about the CNS space as being limited in terms of market size there due to age demographics.
Okay, yes, I guess there was some concern by the sender in of the question that you're going to get some resistance from the healthcare approval authorities, depending on how they run their health economic models, I suppose. But particularly here in Britain, as you know, we can be quite difficult to convince on when you talk to NICE about whether or not it's effective. Yeah, that can be quite hard. What if any are the differences between the CNS segment structure, the structure of what's going on in the moment, presumably in terms of development? Is that what it means? CNS segment structure versus other disease segments. How might this affect the rate of uptake? Maybe that's about demand side, is it, and how you go to market with them through the healthcare professionals and so on. Are they geared up to take an avalanche of these drugs, given that they're not in habit of having much available at the moment, and presumably the level of resourcing they have in the healthcare infrastructures of the various countries isn't necessarily as sophisticated and developed as it would be in other disease areas?
Yeah, so that's another good question. I think ultimately, in terms of a lot of what we've talked about today has been looking at the clinical development pipeline. You know, these things do still take time. Ultimately, when these drugs come close to approval, there's normally big efforts, and, you know, like I said, you often see these smaller companies get sort of taken up by the big pharma companies, or those that are set up for the commercialization side of things, and they are well equipped to manufacture, distribute all sorts of different types of drug products when they become ready to launch. Again, I think the challenge there isn't too bespoke for CNS. It's part of the commercialization side of things for all drugs. And I think, yeah, despite there being new technologies come through, as we see new therapies sort of cross the hurdle through to approval, yeah, the companies that are there doing it are sort of well set up for the manufacture and distribution side of things. They've got relationships with the places where these therapies are administered. So, yeah.
Yeah, I suppose the question was more about I get that they kind of, obviously the big pharma have geared up. They've got the sales channels, they've got distribution channels in place, but are there enough clinicians at the user end to actually consume these drugs, given that they're not in the habit of consuming large volumes of drugs in these markets at the moment?
Yeah, I see what you mean. Look, I think ultimately, yeah, there's often challenges in number of clinicians available. I think ultimately, as we're seeing these aging demographics, the need will become greater, and ultimately that should drive an increase in accessibility, if that's the concern. I think that should scale, hopefully.
Well, there's a lead time on that, of course. It takes
Of
how many
course.
years to train a consultant or
Yeah. And that
dispensing,
can come down to sort of government
and
budgets and
if
things
they,
like that.
if their contact time per patient is going to ramp up considerably as a result of having new technologies available to them, then you're going to need more clinicians, and
Sure.
they take 10 years to come to market. So as long as the drugs do.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So, okay. Okay. So and in terms of the structure of the drug development, I'm just reading this. How does what does this mean for individual? I think you've touched on this one already, but are there any different factors? You talked about probably these are at the long end of development cycles because of the nature of the difficulties that they're involved in developing CNS type drugs at the moment. But are there any other kind of unusual factors that we should take into account when trying to make investment decisions and picking winners, if that's what people want to do? It's not something I'll be able to do, but there may be people listening who do that kind of stuff.
No, of course. I mean, yeah, everyone would love to be able to pick the next winner. It's not easy. The data's complicated and can be hard to interpret. I think in terms of those specific considerations, it does come down to duration. As we're sort of treading new ground in, the brain's the most complicated part of the body, right? There's probably one of the organs we know the least about. So yeah, there's extended timelines there. I can think of that's specific to CNS as a consideration for investors. But yeah, look, ultimately all drug development's challenging, and I think again with that extended patience has the potential for higher rewards. But yeah, that does come with the risk that you can wait a longer time and still be disappointed. There's nothing's confirmed until you get those phase 3 readouts, and even after that you get that sort of regulatory decision.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so it sounds as though that's the key one. The rest of the factors, the structure of the market, the way the players operate in it, and so on, is probably quite similar to other disease areas. We've got some more in here. We've got Ray Williams asking, how far have companies specializing in cell and gene therapy for CNS disease progressed? And are there any outstanding examples of such companies?
Yes, so cell and gene therapies we touched upon earlier, that's maybe better known for maybe more the oncology space a lot of the time. It's a lot more in its infancy for the CNS space, from what we've seen anyway. I think one that we mentioned in the report was a company called Voyager. I think another one I've come across, although it might be private, was a company called Blue Rock. These are looking at cell and gene therapies, and these approaches ultimately rely on the fact that there needs to be like a specific, say, like genetic mutation that we're looking to target, and there's a lot of conditions out there which we know about in terms of genetic mutations. There's a lot where it's still unclear, so I'd say that's a lot more in its infancy. But if you want specific companies to look at, we do mention a couple in the reports. I think Voyager and Blue Rock I'd encourage to have a look at. They're the names that come to mind.
Okay, thank you. And one final one here was, how big is the potential for lupus?
Lupus. That's not one actually, I'm afraid, that we dove into in the report, but you know, it's a good question, and I'll be happy to take a look at that one and get back to you in writing, maybe.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. Well, we've got that was one more question from Ray Williams, so I'm sure we can get the answer back to him if you could give us something on that in the next couple of days.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, of course.
I think that covers everything, actually, guys. I don't think there's any more at the moment. So unless anybody's going to type something in while we wrap it up. So thank you, both of you, Neil and Aaron, for coming along, spending an hour of your time with us. And that's quite a detailed report you've put out there. So it'll take some absorbing. I've had a scan through, but can't believe I can't begin to understand all of it at the moment, but it's a really thorough report. So well done for putting it together, and I'm sure people will be very interested to see what else is in there when they get the chance. So thanks for coming along this evening, and look forward to seeing you again in a few months' time, maybe with another Meet the Analyst session with our members. So take care and have a good evening.
Fantastic. Thank you.
All right.